today we're talking about managing expectations. And this is a big one. And the thing about expectations is sometimes we have them and we don't know we have them, or I don't know how to describe that. It becomes this kind of pebble in our shoe that maybe is like a rock, and it starts to irritate us. And then we realize that we've got this expectation that we weren't aware we had. And or guess what? We have an expectation, it's stated, and people aren't living up to it. What the heck?
Or maybe it's unstated. Because when you think about expectations, we have our own personal expectations of a situation or a commitment or something. And then we assume that the other person understands that the expectation needs to be met on my terms.
Mhm.
And I think that's, if we can kind of dig into that and how
Mhm.
expectation can really bite us in the butt if we don't understand that it's an expectation or don't frame it as an expectation, turn it into a boundary or turn it into an ability to communicate what it is that you want out of a certain situation.
It's interesting is because to your point, so unexpressed expectations, that really leads to number one, assumptions. That really is part of the problem. And if we don't flesh them out, because really everyone hears or understands things differently, that then leads to some unmet expectations that builds resentment, and then it turns into a cycle and we start to fall into this kind of confrontational mode, when in fact if we were able to state those expectations up front and or boundaries, if you will, I think that we would all be better off. I mean, we know that we state expectations all the time. And I got to say that sometimes we even step over it and it bites us in the ass. So, why don't you lead into? I think you had, I'm going, I don't know, we talked a lot today about different stuff, but tell me a little bit about some of the expectations that you've come across that weren't stated, and kind of give us an example if you can.
Well, I think first of all is understanding that stating expectations can create resistance. And when you state an expectation, you state and you express what you want. And sometimes we're not willing to do that because we don't want to be rejected or we don't want it to our want to not be fulfilled. So sometimes we just want to just like step over the fact that we have to say something out loud as to what we want. So expectations truly are about saying what we want, creating a boundary, and then be willing to let the other person say no, or the other person say, I can't meet that expectation.
Yes, and so let's give it a bit of a more definition. So if you define definition, it's a strong belief that something will happen or be in the case in the future, be the case in the future. For example, an event or an experience, and it's also a belief that someone will or should achieve something. For example, maybe win a race. How about an expectation of somebody doing a great job or being on time? And we have these expectations, and that can happen within our own teams, within our own families, with our significant others. And we operate on these, on top of these expectations, sometimes that we have not stated. We have an expectation of somebody, sometimes of a family member, a team member, because they got a great track record. They're smart, they got this. And then when they drop the ball or they don't meet that expectations, we can find ourselves irritated, sometimes even critical. And the other person's looking at us like going, what the hell?
Well, the key word that you said there, hun, was should.
Mm,
That to me, that's really where, if we drill down into what expectation is that you should know, or here's what I want, and you should do this. So expectation creates a boundary, but it also creates a disconnect between the person that you're communicating with.
mhm,
So if I think about where I've had an expectation of you, for example, and I just assume that you understand or you can read my mind. That's the other
mhm.
thing about expectations, is that you assume the other people can read your mind and they're going to fulfill on what it is that you assume that they understand based on the fact that maybe you didn't state your expectations.
Well,
But
sometimes I use the term, I thought it really loudly.
you do. You do. And you know what? Good thing I'm a bit of a mind reader in our relationship because I can figure that kind of stuff out. But
Mm,
that for me comes from the work that I do and try to really come from a place of self-awareness and relationship connection and relativity. But what happens, I think, in in the real world is that if we don't state our expectations around what it is that we want or what it is that we think we need in order to move forward, think of a business deal. If you don't state your expectations or you don't have a boundary, the other person can't figure out what it is that they need to do to fulfill on that expectation.
Mhm.
So there's the hierarchy that happens in business, or if you're in retail, for example, you're in a sales situation. If somebody comes in and they don't really know what they want, but the salesperson has the expectation that maybe they want a, I don't know, a cheaper skate or a cheaper thing, but the person comes in and they don't have the mindset of I want the cheapest thing. They have the expectation that I want the most functional and the most reliable product. Then sometimes those expectations get unbalanced in that regard as well. And that's where you think about, in a sales experience or an exchange, that expectation can really bite you in the butt.
Well, in business, it can also, it really does come to back to bite you in the butt. You said a couple things that kind of tweaked a couple things with me. Not the least of which is because we're in the business of service, and in our retail environment, we are a specialized service. So that's the standard that I have in my mind if I'm going to buy something that requires some expertise. And so if I walk in the door, I have an expectation based on my own business of delivering service, of delivering expertise, of being able to guide our clients. It's like for example, within the shift coaching program, we have an expectation of ourselves, but we also have an expectation of our clients. We talk about this often, which is that expectation that they're coachable. Now, they also have an expectation of us. We try and be very, very clear on what they should expect or what they can expect, and we want to deliver on that. Now, when we go back to the more simple things, so when I walk in, my point is that when I walk into a service center and I'm dealing with somebody that I expect to be an expert, or I want guidance around, or I want a good sales guy because they know what they're talking about. I love that, by the way. I love being sold to. The
Me
point
too.
is, by good salespeople, nothing is better for me. I love it. But if I have, based on my own experience, and expectation that they don't meet, I'm shut down. I'm out. I'm done. I'm not interested. So that's all to say this. That's kind of a broad, we have expectations of how we show up, what we want, and it's based on our values. And this is the real fundamental breakdown that we see when we're talking to people, is that we have expectations based on our values. And of course, we talk about values a lot because it is so important to have really a great life, a great business, a great experience, is understanding what your values are. So I'll just break it down really simple, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. I know this has been a little bit long-winded. Sorry.
I love when
Anyway,
you're long-winded. Don't worry. Keep going. Keep going. I love it.
anyways, the point is this: is that for staff, for example, if one of my highest values is that people show up on time. Now, here's a kind of a stated expectation with my teams, is that if you're supposed to be there at 10 and you show up at 10, you're late. Because I know this, after this many years in business, somebody walks in the door at 10, they got to go to the bathroom, they got to grab a coffee, they got to organize their desk, they got to turn on the lights, whatever the story is. So all of a sudden, that 10 a.m., as an example, start turns into 10:15, 10:10, 10:20. Oh, you got to talk, get grounded. No, 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 no. So if you've got a 10 o'clock timeline, then to me, you're walking in the door before 10, depending on the scenario. And you are showing up so that 10 o'clock's the start. Now, I'm not saying that's right, by the way. That's my values. That's how I believe people should start. If I have a 10 a.m. meeting, I want people to show up. They're there and they're ready to go at 10 a.m., not 10:05, not 10:15. Let's go. Let's get this handled. That's my own expectation. I state those with our team. So that's just an example of how you can be let down and frustrated on a regular basis if you haven't stated that expectation, which I state.
But then you're in the assumption piece of the expectation. You're assuming that the people that you have that are meeting with you at 10 have the same values around being prepared, having their coffee, having gone to the bathroom, having parked, having walked to the to their desk and got organized and replied to a couple emails so that they're present for you at that 10 a.m. meeting. I think what happens sometimes is that in a paid world, let's say in retail or in certain situations, if they say you're starting at 10, they start at 10.
Mhm.
They're going to get paid from 10. They're not getting paid from 9:45.
No, I pay them, by the way. I'm just saying this out loud. I pay them from 9:45.
No, I know that, but I'm saying
So
for
so
the
but
people that
I
are
want to just
listening.
I'm interrupting you because
You
I want to be
are.
clear. It's important. Is that in these circumstances, if I stated an expectation and somebody says, I can't meet that expectation, and especially in a work environment where that's part of their job, then we have a problem. Because at that point, I'm going, oh, well, then this scenario doesn't work for you because within the environment that we've created, within the culture that we have, early is on time is late. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it just is a way to manage expectations, which is what this podcast is all about.
Well, if you have
Okay.
the guts and the courage to say, okay, so in my businesses, if you're 15 minutes early, you're late. Because you need let's say in quantum speed, for example, you need to get there. You need to put your skates on. You need to talk to parents. You need to check in with the players. You need to manage dressing rooms. There's all those things that go on, but we don't get paid until the top of the hour, for example.
It's
But
true.
as a professional, how do you prepare yourself to do the best job, to do the best work, if you're not bringing your whole self to the party beforehand? Like, I think about preparation. I remember when I was with the Oilers, Glenn Sather always said that it's not about perfect performance, it's about perfect preparation.
Mhm.
Because if you're prepared, like if my ice time's at 10 a.m., for example, if I show up at 5 to 10, I'm not prepared. So maybe I'm the best in the world and I can just pull it out of my butt and start teaching skating to a bunch of pro hockey players. That's great. But that's not how I wanted to show up. So
Mhm.
when we have the expectation of ourselves to be professional, to be organized, so those are my values. So when we create conversations in our teams and the people that we're supporting and building around us, we will also want to know what their values are. How do you prepare? How do you want to bring yourself to the 10 a.m. meeting? Are you starting at 9 a.m. or are you just screaming into the meeting at 9:57 and expecting to be able to be present to that meeting? So I think when you express those expectations, then there's not as many assumptions when it comes to how people show up in those meetings. And there's less disappointment and less judgment and less frustration when you express those expectations up front.
Well, this really is an important conversation. You know, what you said is really important in a couple different aspects. We have the expectations of ourselves if we live into our values and what is meaningful to us and what is our, I guess, standard of performance, if you will. So we have an expectation of ourselves, which then is one of our values, and therefore we have an expectation of others. You know, I'll give you an example. We talk about meetings because that's a common one in the world of business. You know, JG, who we talk about a lot, you know, part of is the CGO of the Real Estate Investment Network. You know, JG is really clear. Do we have an agenda for this meeting? Why are we having this meeting? And literally, if we're in a meeting and if we're like 5 minutes in and nobody's clear what we're talking about, he just
He's
disappears.
out.
He's out. Like he just disappears. He doesn't even say goodbye. But we know that because he stated that expectation. Don't set up a meeting without a agenda. And so it's great. We all agree with that. We've all said, no, that's a reasonable thing. We don't want to waste our time. None of us, you know, we have far too many meetings that we seem to be caught in days of meetings and we just go, we got to get to work, right? So that's all to say this is it's stating an expectation and then it's meeting that expectation.